and welcome back to my channel. My name is Caitlin. If you're new, today I'm going to be talking about all the books I read in 2021. I read a total of 20 books. I set a goal for myself at the beginning of the year that I really wanted to get back into reading to help me as a writer. So I set the goal of reading 10 books. I exceeded that and actually ended up reading 20 books. And I read some really great books this year. I had some books that I absolutely loved. But also some books that were pretty much misses, and then a lot of books that were kind of in between. So if you guys want a full breakdown of all the stories that I read this year, if you kind of want some inspiration for your reading list for 2022, then keep on watching this video. So if I was kind of doing the Spotify Wrapped of genres, if you will, I would say the most common genre that I read was commercial fiction, which pretty much makes sense since that just encompasses a wide variety of fiction. But I also read a lot of thrillers, some romance novels, some upmarket literary fiction, and some chick lit. Surprisingly, I did not read any YF or dystopian novels, which I'm usually a pretty big fan of. But speaking of dystopian novels, if you're in the market for a new story to read, consider picking up my self-published book, The Sweep, which I published in November of 2019. It's definitely dystopian, has a really strong female protagonist, some elements of romance, and I think this really speaks to the story's dystopian nature, that it kind of foreshadows the pandemic and how the government has responded to the pandemic. So if you're kind of interested in that and you want something that's really close to real life in a way because it is fiction, then consider picking this up. It's available on Amazon. You can purchase it for 99 cents for your copy for your Kindle or iPad. And I believe it's like $6.99 if you want the hardcover copy. So just throwing that out there, and be sure to be following me on writing Twitter. I'll have it linked in the description box as always. KGrecoLit, that's where I give all of my updates as a writer. But let's go ahead and jump into this video. So the first book I read, I actually started reading it the last week of December 2020, but I finished it early in January 2021, and that was The Girl on the Train by Paula Hawkins. I do read all of my stories on my iPad, so I don't have any physical copies of the book, unfortunately, but I'll insert some images here and here. But this story was amazing, probably my favorite book that I read of the year. It got me off to a really strong start with reading. It's a voicey thriller. I don't love like super gruesome thrillers, but I love thrillers with a lot of voice and a lot of character, and that's exactly what Paula Hawkins did in this story. I have no idea why it took me so long to read it, but essentially the main character is an alcoholic and she's struggling with this addiction that she's picked up as the result of her failed marriage, a couple miscarriages, and she goes on the train every day to and from London, and she has this paper bag with a bottle of wine in it, and she acts like she's going to her job when in fact she has been fired, and she's just going to keep face and keep some sense of normalcy in her life. And what happens is she witnesses something she can't quite remember one night, and that kind of ties into this murder of this girl who disappeared, and no one knows what happened to her. And so the main character has to dig deep into her brain and really start to pick up the pieces of what happened that one night and see if she can possibly find any clues about this missing girl, Megan. So it's really juicy in multiple different ways. It plays into a lot of different relationship dynamics. It does touch on alcoholism. And it's just really fast moving and well written, and I definitely recommend it. The next book I read was also a thriller. Like I said, I was pretty strong with thrillers in the first quarter of the year. I read My Lovely Wife, and the story started strong. It really hooked me, but I think the lack of characterization kind of bored me in the middle, and then the story got really terribly gruesome at the end. And I also thought the ending wasn't too wrapped up. So for me, it was just a very okay book. It just got too gruesome, I think. But basically it's about a husband and wife who are this like killing duo, and they go out and commit these horrible crimes. But they're just a regular everyday family, and they have two kids, and they take their kids to soccer practice, and the husband is a tennis coach, and the woman I think is a real estate agent, and they just live this very normal and almost wholesome life, but they like plot these killings. And the first time they killed was out of necessity, it was out of self-defense, and then they kind of got infatuated with it. And so I think that's why the first half of the story was okay for me, because it wasn't like as gruesome. But then as the story got into it, you really see how psycho the wife actually is, and it's just a little too descriptive and gross for my liking. The third story I read was Before We Were Strangers, and this is a romance novel, and this caused me to realize that I don't really like romance on its own. I like romance wrapped up in sci-fi or YAF or historical fiction, but just romance on its own, I find it very hard to be engaged in the story. I kind of find it boring and lacking something. This story also was very strong sexually and a little bit too vivid for me. I would prefer more of a fade to black. But overall, I found myself rooting for the characters. They were all very likable. The next story I read was The Wife Upstairs, and this is kind of a allegory, if you will, to Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. And it basically tells the story of a girl. She is running away from her past and she's very poor. She happens to stumble upon this very wealthy man who seemingly has everything, but his wife went missing and no one knows what happened to her, and people kind of presume that maybe he had a hand in it, but she falls in love with him, and what she finds in their house is not at all what she expected. It's a very twisty story and it's told from multiple perspectives, and I did like it overall. Appropriately, the fifth book I read was In 5 Years by Rebecca Serle, and I really liked this story. It was so good. It was probably one of my favorite stories that I read all year. It is about a pretty somber topic, but the reason why I really liked this story was I really related to the main character. She was a little bit older than me, kind of in her young 30s, and she's sort of going through this identity crisis. She seemingly has the perfect life. She is a lawyer, and I think she's just made partner, and she has a very wealthy fiance, and they're all very happy on paper, but she is kind of delaying her marriage because she's not really happy inside. And that all changes whenever her best friend gets diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and suddenly her world just flips upside down. But the story is very voicey and very well told. It is a pretty sad book, so definitely some trigger warnings if you're sensitive to cancer and those types of topics. The next story I read was The Silent Patient by Alex McLadies. This was obviously a very popular book on many people's list this year. It was a thriller, very fast-paced, and I really enjoyed it. It was definitely a really strong book. I can't say it was one of my favorite books, but I really liked it. My prediction was that the narrator of the story killed his wife Kathy like Alicia killed Gabriel, but that was not correct. You know, if you read the story, you know actually what happened. But I thought the ending was a little unsatisfying. I wish they would have wrapped it up a little bit more. But great characterization, and again, it's like more of a voicey thriller, and you're kind of uncovering Alicia's past and the affair and everything like that, whereas it's more of a focus on that than like the actual killing of people. I read Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is probably my least favorite story from Taylor Jenkins Reid, and I know that's going to surprise a lot of people, but I really hated the format of the book. It's told almost like a play, like line by line. There's just too many characters in my opinion, and I can't really get into anyone's head. I also thought that Daisy and Billy were pretty unlikable characters. It was kind of hard to root for them. And then I thought it was dumb how the story was told in this like letter format by one of Camilla's daughters. I just didn't really care for how it was set up. But it is very true to Taylor Jenkins Reid in terms of characters and plots. So if you like her other stories, you probably will like that if you can kind of get past the format of the book. I don't think that she explored the backstory of Daisy and Billy enough, and that's kind of the main reason why I didn't feel empathy for them. I then read 28 Summers by Ellen Hilderbrand. The characters were very vivid. It started out pretty strong for me. It's kind of more of an upmarket summer read. Like it's really well written. And the characters are pretty complex. Like I feel some empathy for Mallory because she's innocent and it seems like Jake is sort of not choosing her, but then you kind of get mad at her for not standing up to Jake. But the issue with the story I had was I think you can't keep having the same exact plot and sort of like love triangle dynamic happen, 28 chapters in a row for 28 years. It gets a little bit boring. I kind of wished Mallory had gone off Nantucket and explored other parts of the US. So to me, the story just got a little bit boring and dragged in certain places. And then I think the author kind of overstepped the boundaries a little bit by really bringing politics into the story. And I think politics does have a role in dystopian, historical fiction, things like that. But this was like a summer beach read, and I don't really understand why she had to bring it up. And the one character, his last name was Cavendish, and that's just a little too similar to kind of what was happening in our country around that time. So I wasn't really into that whole aspect of it either. I then read The Whisper Network, which is a story I found actually on TikTok. It's highly underrated. It's very smart chick lit, one of my favorite books that I read all year. I really enjoyed the different personalities of the main characters. Sloane and Artie, Grace, Rosalita, Catherine, they all brought something different to the table. They all had very contrasting personalities and helped tell the story. I thought that it was really great for addressing issues like being a working woman in corporate America, discrimination for being a woman. It also touched on some socioeconomic issues, and it was very fast-paced. The 10th book I read was The Last Thing He Told Me by Laura Dave. Definitely saw this plot before. The husband goes missing, and the police are coming and talking to the wife, and everyone's kind of wondering what happened. So it's kind of a predictable plot, and it wasn't great in terms of plot, but I really liked the voice of the story and I read it very quickly. So overall, I think I liked it and I would recommend it. I also liked the main character. She was a strong female character, but not in an obvious or annoying way. She worked at a furniture store and she really held her own. But then I also thought the ending was kind of dumb, unfulfilling. So many books I noticed in popular fiction, the author's just really not wrapping up the plot and leaving you with a lot of holes. And I'm okay with like looser endings where you can have more of an artful interpretation. But if the story is not that artful, if it's like commercial fiction, I don't understand why the ending isn't being more wrapped up. I then read The Last Mrs Parrish. I think this book is terribly overhyped. I thought it was boring, predictable, and it was the one book that I came really close to not finishing because I just didn't like it. I thought it was very shallow. It's all about this girl, Amber, idolizing this wealthy woman named Mrs. Parrish, and Amber invents this story about herself that her sister also died of cystic fibrosis, just like Mrs. Parrish's sister did, and she invents this narrative to get close to Mrs. Parrish, and it's all about how much Amber wants like the material world of Mrs. Parrish, and we get that Amber grew up poor, and I do feel empathy for her in that way, but overall the story was just kind of shallow to me. And it was also really predictable, I think, with the title. Then I read People We Meet on Vacation. This was one of my absolute favorite books of the year, probably my second favorite after The Girl on the Train. This was so good. I was instantly hooked by the humorous voice. The setup in the first chapter of this book is impeccable. It just made me fall in love right then and there with Alex and Poppy. The characters are warm and quirky. Poppy, this light name of the protagonist. And then Alex Nilsson, he's very quirky. In a way, he reminds me of Nick, my boyfriend. I don't know if it's because he's from Ohio or what, but I just felt a strange connection to it. And I just loved seeing their relationship unravel. It's a very simple plot, but it really demonstrates how a good voice can carry the story. Essentially, the main character, Poppy, feels like she never fit in anywhere, and she is a photographer for a magazine and website, and she gets to go on these lavish trips and explore the world and take photos. And she typically brings Alex on one trip a year, and she and Alex met back in college, and they've just been best friends. They've never, ever had feelings for each other. and then they kind of realize they do, and then plot twist, and we kind of see how the relationship pans out for the rest of the story. But it's a really cute, warm book, and if you don't want anything too heavy, I would definitely recommend it. I then read It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover, another very hyped book and very hyped author. I thought the storyline was compelling. Especially I read the afterword where Colleen Hoover kind of talks about how it was sort of drawn on personal experience, and I think that was really brave and courageous of her to write about these serious topics, abuse within a relationship. The characters were pretty likable, but I will say I thought it was really corny and I just didn't care for the writing style. Like, the main character's name is Lily Bloom and she owns a flower shop. To me, that was really corny. And the dialogue was pretty bad in my opinion. Too much cheesy romance. There was a line, he's unapologetic in the way he F's me. So I just wish the story had more depth. One character, Atlas, did have a lot of depth. He was homeless and I felt a lot of empathy for him. But the protagonist and some of the other main characters, I just felt like it was just a little cheesy and it could have been done better. I then read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, another one of my absolute favorite stories. This is by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I really enjoyed this story. It was so unique and I loved hearing about Evelyn's life. She's this famous actress and she's living this double life, and she's really bisexual and in love with this other actress, Celia St. James, and the story is kind of about her evolving over time, and she takes on these different roles in Hollywood and the way she feels about her beauty, and there's just a lot of different cultural things thrown into the story, but it's very well told. It's just a really fascinating story. I then read A Slow Fire Burning by Paula Hawkins. I liked this one, but it was definitely not as good as The Girl in the Train. The story started in medias res. I think that's a technique that's not really seen as much in commercial fiction. I thought all of the characters were pretty fascinating. They all brought something different to the table. Laura was really fascinating to me. I really empathized with her. She was definitely a misfit. She compares stabbing someone and killing someone as apples to oranges. So you really kind of get the humor in her character. It definitely was a slow burning novel. Like, it was a very slow, suspenseful novel that you really started to understand the characters and care about them. And that was how it was a thriller. There wasn't like tons of plot, but I like that because I really do like character-driven thrillers. I also liked how she used Theo being an author and him writing this book as a parallel to the story. I then read The Ocean in Winter, and I will link all of these books down below. I can't remember the author of this story, but this book was really underrated. I also found it on TikTok. It was so good. I really loved all of the characters, Alex, Riley, Marjorie, how motherhood kind of connected them all in different ways. Basically, the story is about these three girls. Their mother dies of suicide and how it affects them throughout their lives. So it's a pretty heavy book at times, but you really learn about each woman, and I don't think it gets too heavy at any point. I then read Malibu Rising. I love this. This was my favorite book by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which I also know is an unpopular opinion. I think I love this book so much because we were so deep into Nina Riva's head, and Nina is a very compelling character. Nina contrasted with Evelyn Hugo. Evelyn Hugo knows she's beautiful and she knows how to use her beauty. Nina is this like selfless girl that doesn't really realize how beautiful she is, how lucky she is to be Mick Riva's daughter, and she has a lot of trauma from her past and what happened with her mother and father. And so I think the story is just more compelling. I think that's a really big thing to say because I think Evelyn Hugo was super compelling, but Malibu Rising, in my opinion, is just a little bit more compelling. And I love the short and sharp sentences for each chapter. I think that's something I'm taking away as a writer in this story, is that you don't have to have these big long chapters filled with prose. You can be short and to the point. Each chapter is more like a scene rather than a big chapter. And I just absolutely love this sentence. I wrote it down. I took it away from the story. June ended up at the same place she wanted Mick to save her from, the restaurant. your whole world can be falling apart and then Springsteen can start playing on the radio. I then read The Four Winds. This was more of a literary fiction story. I did like this story in a lot of ways. I liked the imagery of the red silk dress. I liked kind of seeing my ancestors in the story with like the Italian heritage. But basically the story is about a girl who grows up right before the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl in Texas, and she has a pretty privileged life, but she's not favored by her family because she's not considered as pretty as her sisters. And she has a condition, and her parents think she's always going to stay at home and live with them and never marry. And she just wants to be loved and she wants to get married. And so one night she sneaks away and she has sex with the guy and they get pregnant, and she's kicked out of her very strict Catholic home. And she has to go live with this guy and learn how to adjust to his family and being a mother for the first time and just all of these challenges. And then the Great Depression hits, the Dust Bowls come in Texas, and the crops are all destroyed. And it's a very sad book. Then they migrate west to California and they deal with rain there and just trouble after trouble after trouble. And it's a really compelling book. And I will say, I don't agree with the author's solution to the problem, which happened in the story, but I could see their viewpoint because of how much empathy I had for each character, if that makes sense. I then read Sweet Girl. This is a random book I found on the top charts. It was pretty well written and quick moving. I think possibly it wasn't a big hit because it was, again, like this super serious and somber topic. It's basically all about like drug abuse, and they're trying to save this baby from these druggy people that are high off on God knows what. So it's pretty heavy, and some of the imagery is kind of gross, and it's just a shocking and like gripping book. But I don't know, I can't say that it was one of my favorite books because it was just a little bit too heavy. Finally, I read The Wish by Nicholas Sparks, another really heavy book, definitely crying during this story. I thought it was going to be all about Maggie, the main character, getting diagnosed with cancer, and I thought it was going to be really all about that, but it was actually a parallel between, kind of her last weeks in New York City and also her getting pregnant as a teenager and dealing with that. So there's lots of romance, there's lots of sadness, but I will say I thought it was pretty predictable. I did like this one quote that Nicholas Sparks put in there from St. Teresa. It says, "When one loves, one does not calculate." And then I did start reading My Dark Vanessa the last couple weeks of December, but I didn't finish that. So hopefully going to finish that in early January. But those were all of the books that I read this year. Let me know if you've read any of these. Let me know what your recommendations are for this year. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye! I made a moment. I said